The fact that men and women are protesting racial injustice and the recent murder of George Floyd, protesting in massive numbers, is an extremely positive development. There should be even more massive protests, and these protests should have been started a long time ago. I'm very concerned about the growing evidence that provocateurs have been deliberately deployed in order to sabotage the legitimate protests of the people. Provocateurs who are deployed in order to incite violence and give a false excuse for reactionary elements to crack down on protest, using elements of the military and the militarized police. The Bill of Rights recognizes the inalienable and inherent right of men and women to peaceably assemble. This right is recognized in the very first amendment of the Bill of Rights, recorded in the founding document of the United States, which declares that there shall be no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. If elements are being allowed by the authorities to incite violence in order to shut down the ability of the people to peaceably assemble and to exercise their freedom of speech and to petition the government for the redress of grievances, then that is a de facto violation of the Bill of Rights and a de facto violation of the Constitution. It's a very cynical tactic for reactionary elements of the establishment to deploy provocateurs who are posing as friends of those who have grievances against injustice, and to have those provocateurs conduct outrageous acts in order to provide an excuse, a phony excuse, for a crackdown using force on those who are protesting legitimate grievances. There's a very long history of this very cynical tactic being used by reactionary forces in order to stifle the desire of the people for change. Following World War II, the people of Italy were showing signs of moving far to the left in support of the leaders and organizers who had bravely opposed and fought against the fascists in Italy during World War II. But instead of honoring the will of the people, reactionary forces within NATO organized terror cells who, posing as leftists, committed outrageous bombings and murders of innocent people in order to terrify and traumatize the population of Italy and cause them to reject the left and clamor for law and order. This history is absolutely undeniable, and you can find abundant documentation about it in books and videos about Operation Gladio. In the United States, when the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s was gaining tremendous traction and more men and women of all walks of life were turning against the war in Vietnam, Charlie Manson was let out of jail and given mysterious sources of funds to buy a bus and support a bunch of young girls and cruise around the state of California, somehow being able to buy not just gasoline and food and clothes and musical instruments, but even machine guns and dune buggies, and hang out with famous musicians and Hollywood actors in Laurel Canyon and at the Spahn Ranch. And in the summer of 1969, the Manson family committed a series of horrific murders in order to terrify and traumatize the people of the United States and the world, and, by the way, try to provoke a race war, after which Manson's face was splashed everywhere by the media, depicting him as a hippie, a violent hippie, in order to cause fear and revulsion among the populace and get people to associate hippies and protests against the war with violence and murder and nihilism. A very similar pattern was used with the creation of the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army in the early 1970s, from about 1973 to 1974, in which, once again, a prisoner was released and given resources in order to head up a supposedly left-wing cult, and it's still listed today if you look it up in Wikipedia as a left-wing organization, and to cause mayhem in order to frighten the American public and to justify the creation of SWAT teams and the gradual militarization of the police, which has continued to this day and has reached a point where the police are almost indistinguishable from the military in terms of weaponry, vehicles, helmets, body armor, and tactics. And this same pattern can be seen to have been used more recently internationally with the creation of the terrorist group ISIS, which could be made to pop up in any country that the criminal plotters of wars of aggression wanted to invade. So during the early years of the 2010 decade, we frequently saw stories about U.S. military helicopters accidentally delivering sling loads of supplies or airdrops of supplies to ISIS fighters. Whoops, don't know how that happened. And so if ISIS shows up in your country, then the U.S. can use that as an excuse for kicking down the door and invading your country in exactly the same way that if violent provocateurs show up at your protest, the militarized police and or the National Guard can use that as an excuse for throwing tear gas and shooting rubber bullets at American citizens and arresting and dispersing people who in all likelihood had absolutely nothing to do with that provocation. It's the same pattern. If provocateurs are being deployed in this fashion in order to subvert the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances and to exercise their freedom of speech, all of which are inalienable rights, which the founding documents of the United States declare shall not be infringed upon, then that is a violation of the Constitution, which every single member of the military is sworn to support and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This fact is extremely serious, and I don't hear it being discussed. Every single man and woman in the United States needs to understand the seriousness of this situation. It's absolutely unacceptable for members of the government at any level to deploy provocateurs or incite violence in this way in order to infringe on the right of the people to exercise their right to assemble and to petition for the redress of grievances. And if this is in fact taking place, then I'm of the opinion that we need to protest even more and continue to escalate the size and the urgency of the protests. And anyone who knows about this going on needs to take the appropriate actions to bring it to light and bring it to justice and to have it stopped, because the Constitution absolutely forbids taking away the people's right to assemble and to ask for the redress of grievances. I have some serious questions about the evidence we've been shown about the murder of George Floyd. I'm not saying he wasn't murdered. I'm absolutely not saying that. But there's some very suspicious aspects, questionable aspects that need to be addressed, which I talked about in a previous video, and those need to be investigated and addressed, and so far have not been addressed or investigated. But there can be absolutely no question about the ongoing and long-standing history of racism and white supremacy institutionalized in the U.S. criminal justice system and in aspects of U.S. society which perpetuate the impoverishment and oppression and mass incarceration of blacks and Native Americans, and which demand protest and which require systemic change in order to correct. That's absolutely been going on for hundreds of years and needs to be addressed. Those changes obviously involve police reform. Some very concrete solutions would be the demand for an immediate and absolute ban on chokeholds of all kinds, as well as a demand for the demilitarization of the police, and a demand for a policy that says the police cannot arrest a man or woman who's not committing an ongoing act of violence. Once again, the Bill of Rights of the Constitution of the United States, the highest law of the land, and a document which recognizes inherent and unalienable rights which belong to every man and woman, states unequivocally that the right of the people to be secure in their persons against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and that persons or things cannot be seized without a warrant. If someone is accused of passing a bad note, a counterfeit bill at a convenience store, it should be understood as unconstitutional to go arrest that person, seize that person without a warrant for his arrest, based on specific evidence, not simple hearsay and not just a hand wave of what he's being arrested for. The Bill of Rights states that very clearly. That's in the Constitution of the United States. The police should not be empowered to arrest anyone and everyone that they please simply on hearsay or simply on a hunch. We should demand that the police cannot arrest you unless you're in the middle of committing an actual act of violence. But police reform is really only the tip of the iceberg. In order to address oppression and poverty and unemployment, systemic oppression and systemic poverty and systemic unemployment, we need to demand real systemic changes. First, unemployment itself leads to all kinds of social ills, including to an increase in racism and also to an increase in extremism and a host of other deadly social maladies. And unemployment is 100% preventable. Serious economists have explained that we could institute a jobs guarantee program which would have a number of tremendous benefits and which would remove the economic fear that drives a lot of racism among the most economically insecure segments of any population. Martin Luther King Jr. actually led a massive march in 1963 called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was attended by over 250,000 men and women, and which had as one of its central demands jobs for all now, full employment. That was in 1963. Another critical systemic change which we should demand is a public banking alternative. Banking is an absolutely critical part of infrastructure in an economy. One of the biggest reasons for the racial disparity of wealth in the United States has to do with the systemic refusal of banks to give mortgages to racial minorities, including blacks. And it's the increase in home and property values since the end of World War II, which has been by far the biggest driver in wealth increase among the population of the United States. And that wealth creation engine has been largely denied to racial minorities, including African Americans, due to systemic exclusion by the banks. It's undeniable. The evidence is overwhelming that has gone on and continues to go on. But banks are also needed for extending credit for starting businesses. If privately owned corporate banks are not serving huge portions of the population, then the government of the people must step in and provide banking that will address the needs of all citizens. And a public banking option would, by definition, do that. One of the best ways to do that, which has been used in other countries with great success, including in Japan, is to give certain banking functions to the post office. There's already a post office in every town and county of the country, no matter how remote or how inner city. And those post offices, the post office itself, could be empowered to provide competitive banking services, low-cost or free banking services such as deposit accounts. They could also provide low-cost mortgages and small business loans to men and women who wanted to use the public banking services. In fact, that idea has been done in this country before, beginning in 1911. So anyone who says that, oh, that idea is un-American, or somehow, oh, we can't do that, that would be un-American, they simply don't know what they're talking about. They don't know their history. The reason that that they stopped doing it is that private banks don't want that kind of competition. The private banks, of course, would be raising a fuss about unfair competition. But the fact is, if they're not providing services to segments of the population, then they can't complain that that's unfair competition because they're not even serving those people to begin with. The public banking option would be for everyone to use, but by definition, it wouldn't be competing with private banks if the private banks aren't even extending those services to huge segments of the population. So these are concrete examples of structural policies that we can enact right now if elected leaders truly want to show that they care about racial issues and equal rights and addressing these long-standing structures of exploitation and oppression in this country. And if they really care about those things, then they should get to work and work overtime and put through legislation immediately which addresses the need to impose severe penalties for any use of provocateurs to interfere with the right of men and women to protest, assemble, and petition for the redress of grievances, and enact immediate police reform, including forbidding chokeholds of all kinds, demilitarizing the police, and prohibiting the unconstitutional ability to arrest citizens who are not actively involved in violence, and create a federal jobs guarantee program which would be completely voluntary, and model it on the suggestions that have been developed over the course of many years in extensive research and extensive thought and debate by serious MMT economists such as Stephanie Kelton and Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler, and create a public banking option available to everyone, and consider doing it through the post offices with an easy online option based on models suggested by economists such as Michael Hudson and authors such as Ellen Brown. All the sacred traditions of all cultures around the world recognize that every human life is given by heaven, by the divine realm, and that the gifts and talents given to each man and woman are precious, and are in fact the very most important resource given to any nation. Other gifts such as rivers and forests and oceans and fields and sunshine and the mineral wealth underneath the earth are also the gifts of heaven to any nation, but the people who are allowed to be born in that country are the most precious resources of all, and no one has a right to take away the life of anyone. That life was given by the divine, by heaven. Economic policies which deny the ability of men and women to use their gifts to the best of their ability are also an affront to heaven. And to the extent that we allow unemployment and underemployment and oppression and exploitation, we're committing an offense against heaven. We need to demand equal rights and justice, and we need to demand concrete changes, systemic changes that will allow every child to use their unique gifts, every man and woman to use their unique gifts that they were given by a power that is higher than any of those criminals who have chosen to stand against humanity.